We're going to go through the museum chronologically. We'll point out some various historic aircraft, and we'll talk about some of the naval aviators through the history of naval aviation and some of the events that they were involved in.
Yeah.
So let us get started.
Navy looked around at various existing bases. This base was here, and Pensacola was perfect. We have this big, beautiful bay. We've got bays on other sides, Perdido Bay, Scambia Bay, East Bay. So there's plenty of room for training. And so this is where we came to start. So you're standing at pretty hallowed ground here. Every naval aviator has come through Pensacola, just like you are, started here. So I mean, think about that. So the aircraft hanging here is an exact replica of the U.S. Navy's first airplane. It was built by Glenn Curtiss. Glenn Curtiss was you could call him the father of naval aviation airplanes. So all the way through World War I, into World War I, we had about 2,000 aircraft, and about 1,900 of them had been built by Glenn Curtiss's factory. So he was the master of seaplanes like that. So that's the very first one. Looks a lot like the Wright brothers airplane, doesn't it? I'm sure you've all seen pictures of the Wright brothers aircraft, but with one major difference. What's that gray thing underneath it? Anybody know? It's a pontoon. Okay, so it's a seaplane. So the Navy wanted the seaplane. So the idea was we would operate airplanes off battleships and cruisers, which we did, eventually in World War II. And it would be a little spotting airplane, a scouting airplane. So when we let the contract for Curtiss to build 2 aircraft, that contract went in for approval on May 8, 1911, and that day is considered the founding day, the birthday of naval aviation. So you guys will get a kick out of this. So the Navy went to Congress and asked for an appropriation for Navy aircraft. So we asked for $25,000. Said $25,000 today wouldn't even buy you a tire for a C-130. So we got the $25,000. 11,000 of it was spent on 2 aircraft exactly like that, and the rest of the money was used for expenses for about 2 years, operational funds. So the first naval aviator was trained by Glenn Curtiss. So when we ordered the aircraft, Glenn Curtiss said, "I'll train an aviator for free." So the first naval aviator, Theodore Ellison, was trained by Glenn Curtiss. The airplane was delivered in June of 1911. And Curtiss flew it about 3 times, and then Lieutenant Ellison got in the airplane and he flew it, and then he signed off the paperwork that the Navy accepted it. So that's the humble beginning of naval aviation right there. Is that we operate off aircraft carriers. So you think about it, you're flying nowadays, could be an E-2, could be a FA-18, and everything. You're flying a high-performance airplane off a 1,000-foot slab of steel going 30 miles an hour through the ocean, day and night. So this is pretty cool here. So these 2 models are exactly the same scale. So this carrier right here is the USS Langley. This is CB-1. This was carrier number 1, commissioned in March 1922. So what's this? October 2023. So 101 years ago, this was our first carrier. It looks pretty archaic, but in 1922, this was state of the art. So you notice there's no island, like the island on this is the USS George H.W. Bush, the last Nimitz class carrier, last of 10. So you have the island. There was no island. That's because this was a converted freighter. It was basically a coal carrying ship. So they sheared off all the superstructure, built a 500-foot light deck. And the smokestacks go down and up. So when you're conducting flight ops, they're horizontal. When you're not, they're up. The bridge is under here, so it was kind of hard. That didn't work out well because the skipper of the ship couldn't see what was going on up on the flight deck. So this thing mainly was a development carrier to determine how we were going to operate aircraft off an aircraft carrier. There's a lot of things that were developed on this ship that we still use to this day. You guys know that on a flight deck, you have all sorts of people doing different jobs, and they wear different colored jerseys. The shirts, they could be green, red, purple, yellow, white, which indicates what they do. So that was developed on this ship way back in the early 20s. The other thing that we use to this day, very important, is the landing signal officer. You guys know what an LSO is? So the LSO is a pilot. Each squadron on a ship has one or two, and then the air wing has two air wing LSOs. And they assist the pilot in landing on a carrier. So you use a light beam to land with. During the day, it's not that big of a deal, but at night, the LSO is pretty critical, because at night it's your depth perception and sort of feel for where you are. The LSO helps quite a bit there. So I was an LSO. I was an air wing LSO. For the last 6 months, I was on the Midway. So straight deck carrier, the deck is straight. And so we had no angled deck carriers. The angled deck carrier is a carrier that has a runway angled off to the side. We did not have the first angled deck carrier until the end of the Korean War. So from 1922 to 1953-54, all the carriers were straight deck. And that caused a lot of accidents, because a plane would come in and land, catch a wire. Remember, you have cables. Straight decks had about 10 to 15 cables. Angled decks nowadays have 3. So when you came in to land, you caught a wire. And then you raised your hook, taxied up to the front. The next plane came in. If he didn't catch a wire, what's in front of him? All the parked airplanes. So as a consequence of that, they realized early on, we have to have a barricade or something to stop the planes that don't catch a wire. And so that's what we did. So all the way through all these years, World War II especially, you'd have 50 airplanes come back from a strike out the Pacific. You'd have maybe out of the 51 would not catch a wire and go into this barricade, which was about 10 feet tall and consisted of steel cables. So the plane would be all torn up. And in World War II, the pilot would get out and they'd push it overboard, because you still have 30 planes airborne. There's no time. So it made for a horrible carrier accident rate. So in 1953, the British came up with this idea, but we modified the first carrier. So we modified the USS Antietam, and we put an angled deck on it, so that made the deck wider. And this probably saved naval aviation in the 50s, because jets landed faster. They didn't have as much. They were kind of underpowered, so it was even worse. So now you come in on the carriers of today. You touch down, you catch your wire, you raise your hook, they retract the wire. And while that's going on, you taxi off the runway over to here. And when the next plane comes in, there is nothing in front of them. So if you don't catch a wire, you just go to full power. That's called a bolter. Comes a touch and go. Drop the aircraft's accident statistics by about 75%. Just that. That and NATOPS. So NATOPS is Naval Air Training and Operations. So every aircraft has a manual. When you go start flight training on the T6, you're going to get your NATOPS, and you're going to memorize it, because everything now is standardized big time. Everything has a NATOPS. Carrier operations, there's a NATOPS manual for that. Launching and recovering airplanes, there's a NATOPS manual for that. So that will be your Bible. And believe me, you may not remember the word NATOPS, but you will in about another, I don't know how long you guys got to wait, like a year now. Another 8 months. If you can get a hold of a T6 NATOPS manual before you start at Whiting or Corpus, I'd do it, because then you can kind of go through it and just sort of look at the airplane and start looking at the systems and all that sort of stuff. So this aircraft right here is a Curtiss MF. This is the oldest airplane in the museum. It was built in 1918. It was in the Navy for 4 years, all 4 years here at Pensacola. So this particular design of airplane it flew okay, but it had a dangerous feature in that the engine is way up there. The pilot, this is actually a trainer. So the instructor and the student, they're in front there sitting side by side. And if you had a hard landing out in the bay or something happened like that, all that's holding up that engine are those wood sticks. And the engine, if you stop suddenly, the engine would fall forward and you would hit a pilot's, which you were not going to survive. So as quick as we could, we went to the type of aircraft where you had the engine up in front of the fuselage. But initially, this is how we did it. So this is kind of a little montage here of the early days of naval aviation.
You notice hangars are all tents. They had tents set up to work on the aircraft. These aircraft are all made out of other than the engine and the running wires between the wings. The rest of it's all just wood and fabric. So they didn't last long, especially down here in the salt water. They deteriorated pretty quickly. So very rare to have a U.S. Navy World War I aircraft still in existence. All right, we're heading this way. Amelia Earhart, first female to fly. Lindbergh. Yeah, Charles Lindbergh. So you think of Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart are two. But you probably don't think of this. Okay, most people don't think of this because Earhart and Lindbergh probably their flights were so dramatic, publicized that they kind of put this thing just on the back pages, if you want to call it that. So this is a Curtiss NC. This is an anti-submarine warfare patrol bomber. And this is the real airplane here. This is not a mock-up. So this aircraft you're looking at was built in April of 1919. So it was designed for World War I, which ended in November 1980. The first one of these was flying at that point, and it was such a good aircraft, Navy ordered 200 of them. A week later, the war ended, and then they said, we don't want 200, we just want 10. And so we canceled 190 of them. This is number 4 of the 10. This is the real airplane sitting here. The massive airplane, 126-foot wingspan, cruised at about 85, 90 knots, which is, just under 100 miles an hour. 4 big engines, 450 horsepower engine. Reason this plane survived is you're looking at the very first airplane that successfully flew across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, it had to make one landing in the Azores, but in May 1919, this aircraft flew from Newfoundland, 1,200 miles to the Azores. Think about that. Just using star sextants, no GPS, no nothing, over the open ocean. Landed in the Azores. They were there for a few days, so the weather improved. They had kind of bad weather between the Azores and Lisbon, Portugal. So then that was a 900-mile flight, no problems. They were in Lisbon for 3 days, and then they flew the aircraft to Plymouth, England. And what that did was that recreated, had the war continued, and they built the 200 of these. That's how you would deliver them to England, to Europe. And so it was the actual reason for the flight was to prove that you could operationally and normally fly these aircraft, many of them across the ocean. Flight originally was 3 airplanes. 2 of them thought they were lost and landed pretty close to the Azores. Both aircraft, when they landed, got damaged, so they didn't continue. But this crew, led by the commander, was Lieutenant Commander Neal. And he was part of combat that day. He called, hey, I got 2 Coast Guards in here, don't I? So, the commander really mainly navigated. So the chief pilot of this airplane, you got to know who was. Yes, Lieutenant Elmer Stone, the U.S. Coast Guard's first naval aviator. Coast Guard naval aviator number 1 was the command pilot of this thing. So, no Marines on board though, sorry. Aircraft. These are all first generation U.S. Navy carrier aircraft for the most part. Grumman Aircraft Corporation and Chance Vought Corporation from after World War, late 1990s, early 20s, until pretty much even to this day. Chance Vaught's gone, but Grumman's still around. Produced about 80% of the U.S. Navy's carrier aircraft. They were the 2 companies that specialized in aircraft carrier capable airplanes. So Grumman Aircraft Corporation specialized, one of the things they specialized in was fighters. So the very first type of fighter built by Grumman is this aircraft right here, the Grumman FF-1. That's the only surviving FF-1. What was the very last fighter Grumman built? Fokker? Yes, F-14, playing on the pole out there. And so, span of aircraft from 1930, basically, the last F-14 retired in 2006. So that is a long time. So this aircraft, which was the very first type of airplane built by Grumman Aircraft Corporation, is pretty advanced. It's got 3 things on it, three new technologies that the World War I planes didn't have. So can you guys figure out what they are? just yell out if you think you know what's different about these other, oh, can't count over there, but the other point. Yes.
People will pitch crop.
No, it wasn't the first one with that, but that was fairly new. But there were a couple of aircraft that had that before that. Variable pitch. Look at the landing gear. What does it do? Can you tell? Got holes in the fuselage. Where do they retract? They retract. First U.S. Navy plane with retracting landing gear. So what happens when you get the gear up? What does that do? Makes you go faster. This was the first U.S. Navy fighter could go over 200 miles an hour. When you got the gear up, it'd do about, on a good day, maybe 210. What's the fuselage made out of? Aluminum. First U.S. Navy aircraft with an aluminum fuselage. So huge difference, right? Everything else is fabric. That's partially fabric. The one back there is all fabric. Fabric rots. You got to replace it, tear it off, put new fabric on. You got to check the spars all the time. Aluminum. And what's the third thing? That may be kind of hard to tell, but this was the first U.S. Navy airplane where the pilots had you have a pilot and a gunner. They had a complete canopy. They didn't have like half a canopy or just a windscreen like the F-4B has. So this was a pretty technologically advanced airplane. So technology just continues and continues. Everything has to get better even to this day. All right, so this was the first type of plane built by Grumman. The second type sort of looked like this, except it was a little. So one thing about the military is that would be all branches of the military are constantly trying to come up with the latest technology. So in World War I, U.S. Naval Aviation technology was anti-submarine patrol and convoy escort. So that was something new that we did. After the war ended, World War I ended, and between World War I and World War II, the technology, vector was headed up very quickly. And so one of the things that the Navy realized in the 1920s was that the next war we have, because now we had aircraft carriers, the next war we're going to be trying to sink ships. And the next war was going to be what? World War II. Japan already had carriers. And we didn't necessarily know we were going to go war with Japan, but at that point, things were kind of deteriorating a little bit. So we realized, how are we going to sink a ship? You can't sink a ship like you would bomb a refinery or an airfield, because they don't move. You had to come up with some way of sinking a moving target. And that is what we did, and that became dive bombing. So dive bombing was pretty much developed in the 1920s. The aircraft at that point were not real good for dive bombing. This was the Navy's first type of operational carrier dive bomber. Problem with this airplane, it still has fabric wings. If you got over about a 50-degree dive, the fabric would start ripping off, which is not good, right? So eventually we got aircraft with metal wings, or mostly metal wings, like the blue one back there, and then you could increase your dive angle. The other problem we had to deal with was when you had a high dive angle and you had a biplane like this, if it did have metal wings or it could go faster in a dive, when you let the bomb go, the bomb is very aerodynamic and the bomb would accelerate in front of the airplane and what's in front of the airplane. So the bomb would hit the propeller. So we had to come up with some method of clearing the bomb from the propeller. So we came up with this device that the bomb is attached to, which just the term for it was a trapeze. So when you release the bomb stayed hooked to this trapeze, which swung down just like a trapeze. And when it got vertical to the fuselage, at its farthest extent, it let the bomb go, which then was below the propeller. We use that on every dive bomber in World War II. So we still use them in World War II, even though the airplanes dived at a much higher airspeed. So technology, you guys are going to be in the Navy for the next, or your Marines or Coast Guard for probably 10 years, right? By the time you get your wings, you're 8 years, is that right? So you said take probably 2 years to get your wings. 10 years from now, what's a lot of the technology going to be on the carriers and everywhere land-based? Drones. Okay, we're already doing it. We got the drone probably next year and a half from now. That's the tanker drone, going to be operational, going to be out on carriers, operating in air wings. The other big thing right now is it's called a loyal wingman. So you'll launch a Super Hornet, and then you'll launch 2 drones that have the same performance as the Super Hornet, but are much smaller and much cheaper, and they will go with the Super Hornet, and the Super Hornet pilot will control those drones. And if you get to the target area,
and it doesn't look good to take the manned airplane in, you'll send the drones in. If the drones go in and do their job and they come back out, good. So technology is always going up, and there's a lot of it right now in aviation. So you guys are kind of be pretty interested. Okay. 1941. On that day, the Navy and Marines frontline fighter was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. It was a pretty tough little airplane, 1,000 horsepower engine. You notice it's all aluminum, single wing, retracting landing gear. But it was not as good as the Mitsubishi A6M0. Okay, so the Zero had about the same size engine, but the Zero weighed 2,000 pounds less. So it was a lot more maneuverable and it could outclimb this. And so what was that 2,000 pounds more on the Wildcat? Armor. Okay, so this plane was rugged, very hard to shoot down. But because you could not dogfight a Zero with this airplane, because you didn't have this good a performance, we had to come up with some way of, if you got in a dogfight or you got jumped, to defeat them. And so that was done by Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch in 1941, just a few months before World War II. We entered World War II. And what he devised at his kitchen table in San Diego, out at NAS San Diego in those days, now it's North Island, with the other pilots in the squadron, today is known as the Thatch Weave. It is still used to this day. Okay, you you guys end up flying Super Hornets or F-35s or whatever. One of the first things you're gonna learn is the Thatch Weave. We used it in the A7. Everybody used it. So it's very simple. So it's actually thinking this up when you think about it. Well, that's pretty easy. So they came up. You have two sections of 2 aircraft. Prior to this, the Navy flew 3 airplanes was a group, and so one guy was out, odd man out. So that he came up with, you have 2 sections of 2. You fly in the Wildcat about 600 feet apart, and you're perfectly parallel. So the 2 pilots here, mainly the lead on this section, could look back behind this section, and this section could look behind them. So they could see if the Zero was coming up on it. When the Zero got to about 1,500 feet behind them, they'd brake, and they'd brake into each other, do a tight turn, kind of cross like this. And when they broke, the Zeros, maybe a couple of Zeros are back here, they're going to go with these guys. These 2 are turning towards the Zeros. And when you get right about here, these guys can start shooting at the Zeros. Okay, now the Zeros are going to break off, or they're going to get shot down. And if you shoot at them and you don't hit them, then you cross and you turn back and you just keep doing this. And this is the weave. You just kept going back and forth until they either went away or you shot them down. And so it was used for the first time at the Battle of Midway. And when it was used, it was 6 F-4F and about 10 Zeros. And went on for like 10 minutes. The Zeros are trying to shoot down the torpedo bombers. So they distracted the Zeros and they came up. So when this thing was over, they'd shot down 4 of the Zeros and lost 1 Wildcat. So it worked. And so that became the standard maneuver. So when it was all said and done, this thing had a 7-to-1 kill ratio. So you can do good with an airplane that's not as good as the one you're fighting, but it's all about your training. So when you get to your first squadron, your first tour is going to be everything about learning how to master your machine. Okay, to be it a helicopter, a P-8, an F-18, whatever. Your first goal is to become the best pilot you can become. Because when you come back to your second tour, your department head tour, that's not your priority anymore. You're still going to fly all the time, but your priority now is leadership, because you're going to, what happens on your third tour? You're the XO of the squadron. Okay, so your first tour is where you have to master flying your machine, whatever it is. So, and which is fun. Why they're painted yellow and what types of aircraft these are. We got some yellow there, over there. There's one hanging over there. What types of planes are these? Right. Trainers. So these are World War II. One over there. That one was post-World War II. That's the first type of plane I flew in the Navy, that one hanging over there. So I mentioned how many naval aviators we have. We winged 62,000 in 4.5 years. Think about that. All at NAS Pensacola and NAS Corpus Christi. And so you started out on these types of airplanes, the biplanes. Those were called elimination trainers. If you made it through that, you moved on.
the T-34. When I went through that at Softly, that was basically an elimination trainer also. And then you move to intermediate trainer, which we have on hang, you can't see. And then the last type you flew was the one hanging there, which is the North American SNJ Advanced Trainer. That one has a tail hook. Some students got their first landings on that. So President George Bush the Elder was a naval aviator, got his wings in 1943. When he got his wings, he was 18 years and 10 months old. To this day, 180,000 naval aviators, he's the third youngest naval aviator to get his wings. He flew that very Stearman trainer right there, the one hanging by the window, which we didn't know. He told us he'd flown it because he checked the bureau number, like Captain Moscow was talking about the number on the tail. It's 5369. He looked at his logbook and he'd flown that airplane twice. And he told the museum, I flew that airplane twice. And we're like, oh, really? So the Navy had like 3,000 of these in World War II. We've had that one for 30 years. So it was just like a normal SNJ, but then suddenly it became like, oh, that's one of the more important airplanes we have now, the president. So it's kind of interesting. It's an actual zero. So raid over Tokyo, April 1942, where we launched 16 Army Air Force B-25s off the original USS Hornet. So they had to train for this, and they did their training at Eglin Air Force Base back at one of the outlying fields, Duke Field, which is north of the main base. So the leader of the strike was Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. So Doolittle was probably the most famous aviator in the United States, not counting Charles Lindbergh, but Doolittle had been in the Army Air Force or the Army Air Service in World War I. He was a air racer. He had a aeronautics doctorate from MIT. He was pretty much the instigator of instrument flying. So he was very, very well known. And so in World War II, he went back on active duty to lead this strike. So when they did their training, they had to learn how to do a very, very short field takeoff that simulated taking off from an aircraft carrier, because you couldn't catapult these. They had to take off under their own power. It's not a carrier aircraft. So they had to have somebody teach them how to do it. So a young lieutenant, Lieutenant Henry Miller, who was an instructor here and had been a landing signal officer and a launch officer on his first sea tour. He's back on his shore tours. He was picked to go over and teach the Army Air Force pilots how to do this very short takeoff procedure. And so he goes over there. He didn't know what he was going to do. He just got orders to go. And so he went, drove over there, and he finds out that the most famous aviator in the United States, or maybe the world, is who he's going to have to teach. Okay, so you have to think about this. So number one, Doolittle has to understand that even though he knows pretty much everything about aviation, the one thing he doesn't know how to do is take off from a carrier. And Lieutenant Miller has to have enough confidence in himself that he could teach these people how to do this. And so it worked out really well, because Colonel Doolittle realized, okay, he's just a lieutenant, you know, he's 30 years younger than me, but he knows how to do something and teach it that I don't know, so I'm going to go along with it. So everything worked out really good. And actually, Colonel Doolittle had, he was one of the ones that had the most problems, and Lieutenant Miller had to get him in there and, you know, talk to him, sort of like, okay, you got to start over, get it all together here and everything. But Colonel Doolittle took it, okay, no problem at all. Mm-hmm. So they took Lieutenant Miller with them on the Hornet. He was the one that launched him off the aircraft carrier. They didn't want anybody else to launch him but him. So it just goes to show, if you're a junior officer and you get tasked with something like that, just be confident, and, you know, and whoever you're trying to teach hopefully will understand that you know more about whatever it is than they do at that point. Probably our most famous flying boat that the United States Navy operated is a consolidated PBY Catalina. There's a complete one up overhead here. Nice cutaway here. This aircraft was heavily used in World War II early on as patrol, open ocean patrol, and also as a night radar on the aircraft, night anti-shipping bomber. And it succeeded at both of those missions very, very well. Towards the end of the war, one of the things it did was air-sea rescue. And probably one of the more famous rescues they did was in late summer 1945, when the USS Indianapolis was sunk. So the Indianapolis was a fast cruiser. and it had taken the first atomic bomb from the U.S. to Tinian Island in the Marianas for use. And so after they dropped it off, they went back to Guam, and then they started steaming toward the Philippines. And halfway to the Philippines, they got sunk by a Japanese submarine. And the bow was blown off. The ship basically just plowed into the ocean, and the water came streaming in, and 900 crew, and only about 300 of them, about 600 of them got off. The rest of them went down with the ship. There was they tried to send out an SOS, but the radio guys didn't realize that the antenna and everything was gone. So even though they typed it out, it never went anywhere. So nobody knew they were missing. They were on a kind of a thing where they weren't supposed to report en route. So here you got 600 guys in the water. There were very few life rafts or anything because nobody had time to get them off. So 3 days went by. At the end of the third day, there were about 300 left. Okay, the rest of them had either drowned or died of injuries, but about half of them had been eaten by sharks. Okay, because the sharks, you know how they are. So nobody knew they were there. They were spotted by a Lockheed PV-2 Harpoon, which was a land-based medium patrol aircraft the Navy operated, but they couldn't land on the water. They reported there were a bunch of people in the water. They launched a PBY from Saipan, which is way over, not far from Tinian. PBY came out there. Lieutenant Adrian Marks was the commander of the aircraft. They get to the location, and they started looking around. I just went, oh my God. So they were all kind of stretched out in about a 4 mile, because the currents had been carrying them. There were a couple of rafts. There were guys hanging on to, pieces of the debris. Some guys just hanging on to each other, single, just lone people here, there, and everywhere. The sea state was 8 to 12 feet, which is not good for a Catalina. It's a little out of its range. So the crew, Lieutenant Marks asked the crew, he said, all right, he says, we can't do anything unless we land. And if we land, we're not going to be able to take off again. Are you guys good with that? They said, yes, sir, we're good with that. So they landed, and when they landed, they damaged the plane, which they weren't going to take off again anyway. But they decided before they landed what they were going to do was they were going to taxi around and pick up the single sailors, because the ones that were together had a little more sort of protection and help each other. But the guys that were by themselves, that's what they were going to do. So within about 35 minutes, they had filled up the entire inside of the plane. They picked up like 26. And this does have bunks and everything, but they were laying all over the place. And so at that point, they just decided, well, we'll just keep whoever we can pick up, we'll pick up. So when they filled up the fuselage, they shut the engines down, and they started putting them on top of the wing. They pulled out their parachutes, they cut off the parachute cords, and they tied all the guys on the wing to the airplane. Okay, and finally they ended up with 56 people, and that was all they could take. So there they were. It got dark. They're floating around with all these people on the airplane. And at about 3 a.m, the first destroyer, because they sent ships out there too, but it took them a lot longer to come out, from Guam and everywhere, or the ones that were in the area. So when they got there, they fired a flare, got the destroyer to come to them, unloaded everybody from there, because they didn't have any water left at this point. And then they got the crew aboard. They sank the airplane, and then more destroyers showed up, and eventually they picked everybody up. So here's this lieutenant, I think he was like 23 years old, who had to make this big decision. Okay, so who knows? Some of you are going to have to make decisions like that at some point when you're probably in the next few years. Who knows? Okay, so but the thing to kind of remember though is, he asked his crew, okay, he wanted everybody, he wanted, total consensus on this before they landed, knowing they'd never take off again. And the crew said, yes, we'll do this. So they had good faith in him as a leader. So that's kind of something kind of interesting that you can think about. Okay, you can touch the airplanes in this museum. We're the rare museum that allows you to touch stuff unless it's roped off. And so this is the most famous U.S. Navy aircraft on display anywhere. So this is the Douglas Dauntless, SPD Dauntless dive bomber. So this was the U.S. Navy's main dive bombing aircraft for most of World War II. Extremely good airplane, very rugged airplane. And this is the type of aircraft that on June 4th, 1942, sank 4 Japanese carriers in one day. One day, okay, and Dauntlesses alone. No other types of airplanes did it. So the Battle of Midway changed the entire course of the war in the Pacific. From the day before, we were on the defensive. The day after, June 5th, we were on the offensive. 6 months into the war. Now, it took a long time to, it took another 3 years, over 3 years, but this is the battle that changed the course of the war in the Pacific. Now, think about this. So that was global power versus global power, the U.S. and Japan. The other global power being Germany. And so, but this was the open ocean global power. And think about today. Think about China. I mean, who else would you think about now? What would it be like? Is this what it was like for the Japanese when they, the Navy, the citizens didn't find out about this probably till the end of the war. But what would it be like if we lost 4 Nimitz-class carriers in a day and a half? It would be stunning, stunning. That's basically what we did. Now, 3 of the 4 sank. The other burned to the waterline. It sank the next day. But they lost all 4 carriers in every airplane, all the airplanes. So it was a stunning victory. This aircraft right here is the only surviving airplane from the Battle of Midway. The only plane left. Japan obviously lost all their aircraft. And we had lots of airplanes that survived Midway, but over the years they were scrapped or crashed or whatever. And so it's now got to the point where this is the sole surviving airplane from the U.S. Navy's most famous battle. Came out of Lake Michigan, where we pulled it out of, but we did carrier flight training in Lake Michigan. And a year after Midway, this aircraft went into Lake Michigan. We pulled it out in 1992 because we do it by the bureau number 2106. So this was being operated by the United States Marine Corps. Marine Scout Bomber Squadron 241 was based on Midway Island. They had 16 SBD-2s, which is this version, obviously. They launched all 16 to go out and attack the Japanese carriers. That was kind of the first wave before the carrier aircraft showed up. And when the squadron came back to Midway, there were 8 left. 8 didn't come back. Never found any of the crew. All shot down. So this aircraft, was a survivor. And so this has got 2 crew members, a pilot and a gunner. And how are they sitting? Can you guys tell? How are they back to back? Okay. So think about this. So you got the pilot. When he does his dive, he's looking through a little telescope that goes through the front windscreen. He's facing that way. The gunner's facing this way. When they dive, this thing dove at 75-degree dive. Okay. Pretty close to vertical, using dive flaps to keep it from overspeeding. So when you're in this dive, the gunner is he's looking up. He doesn't even know what's happening. However, because the pilot's looking through that tube, the gunner has an altimeter in the back, and his job in the dive is to read off the altitude as they're in the dive. Usually it'd be every 1,000 feet or maybe every 500 feet. So normally, the way they trained in this thing, you would drop the bomb at 2,500 feet, 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, and then you would do an 8G pull-out, pulling out at about 1,000 feet. Battle of Midway, the Marine Dauntless Squadron and the 5 carrier Dauntless Squadrons, so 3 carriers that participated, they all didn't drop their bombs till usually 1,500 feet, so 1,000 feet below they were supposed to drop. So instead of pulling out, bombing out at 1,000 feet, these guys were doing 8 to 10 G pulls and pulling out at about 500 feet. So think about that. But they were going to sink the carriers no matter what, because everybody knew if they didn't, that was it. Hawaii was next. Okay, so this was do or die. And so guys died on this strike. Okay, so that's what he did. He pushed it to 1,500 feet, dropped his bomb. When they pulled out, they went right down the flight deck at about 300 feet. So they went down the flight deck, and of course he's just trying to keep the plane, airborne. The gunner, PFC Reed, this was Lieutenant Iverson at PFC Reed, said he was looking down and he could just see Japanese looking at him. And they were 300 feet away, just zooming down the deck at 300 knots. Okay. Sadly, the bomb missed. So when he released it, of course the ship's moving, it went right behind the flight deck. It missed the flight deck by maybe, the round down by maybe 50 feet and blew up in the water, but it didn't damage the rudder or anything. So amazing battle. This is the only surviving airplane, so it's pretty historic. So this is an aircraft carrier scoreboard. So in World War II, all the carriers had something similar. This is the USS Hornet. This is not the Hornet that launched the Army Air Force B-25s. This is the second USS Hornet. The first Hornet the brand new carrier did not even last a year in World War II before it was sunk. So it was sunk down off Guadalcanal in fall of 1942. This is the second Hornet, which lasted all through the rest of the war, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. It is a museum now at the old NAS Alameda, California. So the Hornet, think about this. The Hornet was in a task force of 16 aircraft carriers, okay? And about 100 other ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, armament ships to rearm everything. So all those flags are Japanese aircraft that the air wing on the Hornet shot down. You got all kind of other stuff over there, including they're involved in the sinking of Japan's biggest battleship, the Yamato. But the interesting thing on here is it's a small world. So on the right side, it says strike, and it's got all the areas they struck. What is Formosa? You guys know what's Formosa today? Oh, that's exactly right. Taiwan, okay? Kind of in contest again right now. Cam Ranh Bay, where's that? Vietnam, okay? The Vietnam War is over. So things have a tendency, it's a small world, things have a tendency to pop back up again. So pretty interesting scoreboard there. We have several others. There's a couple more on display. Came out after we had entered the war, so we weren't using them before we entered the war. And these two airplanes are the ones that just totally and completely dominated the Pacific. These are the aircraft that pretty much finished off the Japanese aviation, naval, air, and their Air Force. So we have the F-4U Corsair, built by Chance Bott, and we have the F-6F Hellcat, built by Grumman. Okay, the F-6F was primarily used as an air-to-air interceptor. So we built 12,200 of these aircraft in 2.5 years. And think about that. They destroyed 5,500 Japanese aircraft, air-to-air, and it has a 19-to-1 kill rate. Okay. So for every Hellcat that got lost in an air-to-air battle, Japan lost 19. So think about this, okay? So very good aircraft, very easy to fly, very good, probably one of the best carrier aircraft we ever had as far as just operating off an aircraft carrier, designed very well, very rugged. Corsair. So the Corsair was faster. They both had the exact same engine, 2,000 horsepower, crashing with the R-2800. The Corsair, look at it, it's a lot more radical looking, and it was very radical. It first flew in 1940 before the war started, but it took till 1940, late 42 to get it where it was okay, we can let young pilots fly it. Very unusual wing platform. The wings go down, gull wing, and they go out. This aircraft was a better all-around airplane than the Corsair from the standpoint that it was actually sort of like the Hornet, the original Hornet or the Super Hornet. It's a strike fighter. So it could be a bomber or a fighter. So heavily used mainly by the Marines in World War II. Could carry 2,000 pounds of ordnance. The Hellcat could only carry 1,000. So it had an 11-to-1 kill ratio, which was very good. And it shot down 2,200 roughly Japanese aircraft. But this was the airplane when the Marines took an island. This was the squadrons that showed up. So as soon as the Marines took an airfield, so we mainly only took in World War II, when we invaded an island in the Pacific, it had to have an airfield. So when we took the airfield, we got a squadron of Corsairs in there, and you had ships offshore that provided all the weaponry and bombs for the Corsairs. And then they were right there. So the Marines had instant close air support. So this plane was a really, really well designed and probably the best all-around fighter U.S. Navy had in that period of time. Corsairs were all retired at the end of World War II. They went to the reserves, and they flew in the reserves till maybe 1950. Corsair, the last Corsair was built in 1955. So the jet sitting out there, we're going to walk by in just a few minutes. The F-8 Crusader, built by Chance Bott. First one flew in 1955. 1,000 mile an hour jet fighter. Last Corsair rolled off the Chance Bott assembly line the same year. So it was a great airplane, heavily used in the Korean War. It's just an all-around really good airplane. So we had a couple of interstate pilots that flew the F-6F. Ray Hawkins. So Ray Hawkins was a F-6F fighter pilot in World War II. He was 20 years old, and he had 14 air-to-air kills, which at the end of the war made him number 10 on the Navy ace list. Number 10. 20 years old, already had 14 air-to-air kills and almost a triple ace. He had 3 Navy crossings. Think about that, 20 years old. So we had a whole bunch of 20-year-olds that were aces, and we had one that was 19 years old that was an ace. I mean, think about this. I think when you were like 18 or 19, President Bush, 19 years old, he already had 50 combat missions in the TPM Avenger torpedo dive bomber. Everybody was very young in World War II, very, very young. The other interesting thing is you guys are all going to go through survival training. And we had an F-6F pilot that was actually a squadron commander, and he got shot down. So as a Lieutenant Commander Bob Price. So he was on USS Cowpens flying the F-6F. They were operating in the Marianas 1944 when we were taking all the islands in the Marianas, Saipan, and all those. And he got shot down on a mission. And he bellied his aircraft into the ocean, the Pacific, off an island. Actually, quite a ways from an island, but he went into the ocean. The plane sank before he could get the raft out, so he was in the water with just his Mae West, his flotation. And he's just floating around, and up bobs so these carried a belly drop tank, fuel tank, and this tank was empty when he crashed and it got ripped off. Up comes the drop tank, so he swims over and grabs onto it. Japanese destroyer comes by about 200 yards away from him. He hides down under it. They kept going. So he's out there floating, and one of the planes that was with him saw him, and so they go back, and about an hour and a half later, the Hellcat comes back with 3 Hellcats come back, and one of the Hellcats throws him a raft, opens his canopy and throws him the raft that you had on your seat. So they had a spare raft. So he swims over and he gets in the raft, and in the raft, when he unfolds it, is a note from one of his squadron mates that says, "I will come back tomorrow morning with a OS-2U." Plane under there with the big pontoon is an OS-2U float plane, which were flown off the battleships, the cruisers. "I'll come back with an OS-2U and he will pick you up." And so he goes, "Oh, I'm only going to spend one night out." Next day, if in the morning, he hears airplanes, and here comes a Corsair or a Hellcat with an OS-2U. So he's in his raft. He throws out his die marker, and he fires a pencil flare, and they're coming right at him at about 800 feet. They don't see him. So they fly right over him and keep on going. At that point, he realized, oh my God, they're not going to come back. I'm going to be out here for a long time. So suddenly he goes into survival mode. Okay, so he had a thing of water, big can. In those days, the water came in a raft and a can. I'm only going to take 1 sip a day. So there he is out there. So he rigs up his little, in the raft, you have a little kind of a shade, gets all set, keeps his legs covered. So a couple of days go by. He's not too hungry or anything. He's taking 1 gulp a day out of his can. And so the days go by, he doesn't have any food. A seagull lands on his raft. He grabs the seagull and decides, well, I'll just eat the seagull. Of course, he can't cook it or anything. So he takes it apart and he starts eating some of the seagull meat. And he realizes quickly that this is worse than not eating. It's extremely salty. So now he's thirstier than ever. So the moral of that particular thing was, if you get in the raft, don't eat any seagull. So the days go by. Some fish jumped into his raft, and so those he ate, and they were okay. So that kept him going for a while. But the days are going by and going by. Pretty soon he's down to his basically last gulp of water. And so, and he tested himself. He would ask himself questions to see if he was getting delirious, but he wasn't. And so on day 10, he takes the last gulp of his water. And now he's starting to feel kind of weak and everything. He didn't know it, but at this point he'd already lost like 10 pounds just from just not eating anything. So he's sitting there fiddling on the day 10 in the afternoon. He's sitting there fiddling with something in his raft, and he hears something. It turns around, and about 1,000 feet away, coming right at him, is a U.S. Navy destroyer. Okay, and the destroyer pulls up and slows down, and one of the sailors says, I don't know, anybody go to the Naval Academy? Probably some of you guys, right? So the sailor is pull up, and they're just, almost to a stop, and one of the sailors says, can you take a heave? And that means if we throw you a line, can you catch it? And we pull you aboard. And he goes, yeah, I can take a heave. So they threw him the line, pulled him aboard, and, so he survived this ordeal. So that was the good part of the story. The sad part of the story. So he was a lieutenant commander. So he goes back, I think, to Hawaii, has some R&R and everything, kind of gets back up to speed. They send him back to the Cowpens, the carrier he was assigned to. But now he's the ship air officer, meaning he's in charge of all air operations on the ship. He's no longer squadron commander. So the Cowpens and the entire task force of the Cowpens sails into a typhoon in December 1944, and that they almost lost the ship. But in the course of this typhoon, an F-6F broke loose, slid down the flight deck, hit 6 parked F-4Fs. When they hit the other F-4Fs, it opened the gas tank on the one that slid, and a spark started a fire. So he's the air officer. He's in charge of the flight deck and everything. So he and a bunch of other guys go out in this ship that's heaving all over the place, trying to put this fire out. The airplane's loose. And as they cut the planes loose, he goes over the side with one of these airplanes, never to be seen again. So pretty sad story. So when you go through survival training, you just kind of keep him in your mind and think, okay, I could stay out here for however long it takes till they come get me. Now, those days you didn't have radios. Now you have radios and, and all that. Okay, so we're into the 5th generation of jet aircraft. First generation, F-9F Panther. So this was the Navy's first really operational carrier jet fighter. 5th generation, what's that? F-35. Okay, cool. So had various generations since then. So in the Korean War, this was their primary jet aircraft. You could dogfight with it, but it was not because it was slower and had the straight wing. It was a little outmatched by the Big 15. So in the Korean War, we mainly used these as interdiction aircraft, not close air support, but striking, big targets. So one of the young pilots that flew the F-9F in Korea, his name was Neal Armstrong. It was Neil Armstrong. It's his wife, okay? First man up on the moon, okay? Naval aviator. So probably his biggest event in the Korean War, and he was 20, okay? He was going to Purdue, and when the Korean War started, he was at ROTC at Purdue, and he'd already done 2 years. If you had 2 years of college, you could apply to be a naval aviator. But because he was at ROTC, they called him up and sent him to flight training. So here he is, like 20 years old, and he's flying an F-9F in Korea. So he was on a mission, 2-plane. He was number 2, and it was an interdiction to hit a rail yard, and they were going to get to the rail yard by flying down this valley that kind of flew downhill. When they got out of the valley, they were going to make a turn, and there's the rail yard. So as they were going down the valley, they were at about 500 feet. The North Koreans had strung steel cables across this valley, like giant, like huge telephone wires or whatever. And his right wing hit a cable. He was in a turn, sheared off 6 feet, including the drop tank on the end of the tip tank, sheared off 6 feet of the wing and most of the aileron. And so the plane started to roll, but he managed to get it under control, jettisoned all his ordnance. So of course the lead went with him, and they flew to a land airfield, not back to the carrier, but to an airfield farther south in friendly territory. He couldn't slow down the airplane more than about 250 knots, because if he did, he lost control. The other aileron didn't have enough power to keep the plane from rolling over. So he knew as he's flying back, he says, there's no way I can land this thing, so I'm going to have to eject. So they got back to the airfield, and they flew over the airfield, and he ejected from this plane had ejection seat, and ejected from the airplane and survived. So he was the first pilot on the carrier in the air wing to eject. So everybody was kind of wondering about the ejection seats, but it worked fine. So he was very cool, calm, and collected, which helped him dramatically when he was an astronaut because if you recall, when they came into land to make the first landing on the moon, the lunar module Eagle, when they got to the spot they were supposed to land, there was a crater. They couldn't land where they were supposed to land. So he very coolly took the lunar lander, moved it over, found a spot, and of course the fuel was going away like crazy. And when he touched down, they had 30 seconds of fuel left. Okay, very cool, calm, and collected. So when we go over here, after we finish here shortly, go over the other building real quick. Mr. Goodspeed will show you his flight training jacket, where you will see that he was a below average student when he went through flight training, but he was a quick learner every now. So something to think about, especially when you go through flight training. Okay, so this is Hangar B1. This is primarily Vietnam to present day, with a few other odds and ends. This very large transport here is a Douglas R4D military version of the DC-3 airline. Douglas built, 7,000 or 8,000 of these in World War II as transports. This one is pretty historic. It did fly in World War II, but you notice, if you can see on the main landing gear, it's got snow skis. This is a tail dragger, so on the tail wheel, it's got a snow ski. So the aircraft here, this very airplane, was the first airplane to land at the geographic South Pole. So on October 31, 1956, the crew of this plane flew over, landed, stopped, and when they did that, that was it. Lots of planes had flown over, but no planes had ever landed there. The last people to stand at the South Pole was in 1911, and no one had been actually at the South Pole since then. So they stopped. It was very cold, high altitude, so they didn't shut the engines down. They took turns getting out. So when they got out, they were the first Americans to stand at the South Pole. So it's a pretty good deal. So when they took off, they knew it was going to be kind of hard to take off because of the high elevation and cold weather and the snow. So they carried JADO bottles, rocket bottles that burn for about 30 seconds. Each bottle provides about 900 pounds of thrust. So when it came time to take off, Commander Gus Shin, who is still alive, he's 101 years old, earlier this month. He lives here in Pensacola. So they put the engines to full power. They didn't move because they were still kind of stuck a little bit down in the snow. Fired 2 bottles, they got it going. And once they got going at about 30 or 40 miles an hour, he fired all the other bottles, and then they got airborne and flew back to McMurdo. So just like the NC-4, like Captain Moscow talked about, we didn't have a museum. So when this plane came back in 1959 from Antarctica, we donated it to the Smithsonian, who had nowhere to put it. And so in the early 90s, mid-90s, when we announced we were going to build this building, they gave it back to us, and we hung it up. so they can't get this one either. So actually, I don't know, they probably wouldn't want it anyway. So Vietnam War. Operations started, and official operations started in August 1964 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. We had advisors there already helping the South Vietnamese military. They'd been there for several years before that, but the official ops started then. So 2 of the aircraft that were heavily used in the first few years of the Vietnam War were the Chatspot F-8 Crusader. That's a Crusader sitting outside, but that's a photo reconnaissance version. Has no guns. It's strictly got campers in the belly. This is the fighter version. And the other one, which even predated the F-8, is the 8 Douglas A-1 Skyraider, which was the U.S. Navy's last piston engine combat aircraft. And these were heavily used in the Korean War, and then heavily used in the Vietnam War up to about early '68, when the North Vietnamese at that point had lots of surface-to-air missiles. So that's when I flew the very last mission of a combat mission of an AWA. So the F-8, which came out in 1955, was the world's first single-engine fighter that could go over 1,000 miles an hour straight level, operational fighter. So it was a going machine. And the pilots were very, very good at their fighter pilot occupation. They specialized in close-in dogfighting, not shooting down aircraft like the F-4 from 20 miles away. And they had to do that because it has 4 20-millimeter cannon, and you can see 2 on each side. You can see the little gun openings. And then When it got developed, when we first had this, it wasn't operational yet. The Sidewinder missile, a little missile hanging on the fuselage. So that's a heat-seeking missile, homes in on heat. In the early versions, we carried them on the A7. We carried Sidewinders on every mission, or self-defense, usually one. But that thing's got a 5-mile range, homes in on heat. And the early ones there are only two things that could home in on: the hot tailpipe of who you were going to shoot down, or the sun. Okay, because it would home in on the sun. So you had to get behind the enemy airplane to shoot it down. It was just like World War II, except you had a 5-mile range missile. So because of the pilot's skill and this little missile and the guns, when the Vietnam War ended, the fighter that had the highest air-to-air kill rate was the oldest fighter there. So these guys, when the MiGs saw an F-8 show up, they left because they knew they were going to get them. So it was a very, very good aircraft. At this point, they were starting to be replaced by the F-4. By the end of the Vietnam War, I think there were 2 or 3 carriers left that had F-8s. Everybody else had converted to the F-4. The F-4. So this is the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II. Very storied fighter, flown for years and years, this type of aircraft. 2 engines, 2 J-79s. The F-8's about Mach 1.4, 1.5. This thing is Mach 2.1, so it's much faster. And now you got a pilot and a NFO, a RIO, radar intercept operator. So this was designed as a missile fighter. It has no gun. Only U.S. Navy fighter that never had a gun. So we learned a lesson on this, okay? So it's a missile interceptor initially designed to shoot down Russian bombers. Okay, it was designed in the late mid-50s and first flew like 1958. So the threat was what? The big long-range Russian bombers. So it had very, very big, very good missile system, the Sparrow missile system, radar guided. The radar on the nose was specifically for the Sparrow missile, so it's kind of like a system. Now you could carry Sidewinders also. So when the Vietnam War started and the F-4 started, escorting strike aircraft into the targets in North Vietnam, they found out something horrible. And that was they were going to shoot down a big bomber 30 miles away with this missile. They were going to have to end up dogfighting these very agile little MiG-17s and MiG-19s, which would pop up out of nowhere. They wouldn't be at 40,000 feet, 50 miles in front of them. They were below them, coming down from above them. So these guys were not ready for that. So they had been trained to be missile firers. They weren't trained to dogfight. Now you had some F-8 guys who had transitioned to this already, and they still were able to dogfight, but they had the issue of they didn't have a gun, and so a lot of times they didn't have this little Sidewinder. So the F-4 had a horrible time from 1964 to 1968. And we had a lull over North Vietnam from 68 to 71. So when the lull started, the kill rate for the F-4 was 1-to-1. So for every MiG we shot down, we lost an F-4. Total and complete unsatisfaction. So we had a report. It was called the ALT report. Everybody already knew this, and the ALT report was done to examine and see what we needed to do to fix this. And so the major outcome of it was what? Anybody know? Top Gun school. Yes, Top Gun. We need to teach the F-4 guys how to be fighter pilots again. And so who were all the instructors? F-8 drivers. Okay. So you had about a 2-year gap here. So in that 2 years, they ran most of the squadrons through. Anytime a squadron was going on a Vietnam cruise, they ran them through Top Gun. Initially, it was not going to be a permanent school. It was just going to be something to get everybody up to speed. And so when we started air ops over the north again, which is where the MiGs were, in late 68 all the way through January 73, kill rate 10-to-1. Okay, without a gun. So the Top Gun was so impressive and so superior in the training that we still have it to this day. Navy Fighter Weapons School, NAS Fallon, nicknamed Top Gun. Okay, they're so good they said we're just going to keep this forever. This F-4 has a MiG kill. This very F-4 right here. The crew had been a Top Gun. Okay. So shot down a MiG-19 over Kep Airfield just outside Hanoi in May 1972. It was a big dogfight. It was, I think it was 6 6 MiGs and about 8 F4s, and when it was done, the F4s had bagged 4 of the MiGs, and not one F4 had a hole in it. So that was another big validation. So this is a Cayman SH-2 Sea Sprite. This version is an anti-submarine helicopter, been replaced in the fleet by the SH-60s. But the first version of this was a utility aircraft. Instead of having 2 engines, it had 1. It wasn't anti-submarine. It was just a utility to be used for stuff like search and rescue and general transport of people. And so in 1968, HC-7, Helicopter Composite Squadron 7, was the squadron that was responsible for the search and rescue of U.S. Navy carrier aircraft that got shot down or had issues, and everybody had to eject. So we got here. Oh, can't remember his name. It was Clyde Lassen, Lieutenant J.G. Clyde Lassen. Here's the co-pilot, cook, and then the 2 air crew. They were on the destroyer about 80 miles off the North Vietnamese coast, and they had the duty to rescue people. So at about midnight, the rescue bell sounded on the destroyer, and they manned up the airplane. The airplane with 1 engine was pretty underpowered because they had 50. They'd taken the original version had a door here, and they had taken out the windows, and they had a 50 caliber machine gun on each side. They had all kind of other stuff, fuel tanks. So the plane was really kind of underpowered. So they launch at midnight. They go to the coast. They hold about 10 miles off the coast. They think they're not going to send us in here at night. But they did. So they sent them in. They had to go about 20 miles in to where the crash site was. And then it was a F4 Phantom II, and the 2 pilots had ejected. And so Lieutenant Commander Holtzclaw and Burns. And so they ejected, and they landed in a rice paddy. And there was a hill next to the rice paddy, so they decided they were going to go up the hill. So they went up the hill partially, about halfway up, and they had radios. And you had a radio, so you could talk and to crews. So they were already talking to some aircraft that were already in the area, but they weren't helicopters. So in they come, Lieutenant J.G. Lassen. They fly in there, and the aircraft that are there have flares, parachute flares. So they drop a flare. And so they, start talking to the crew that's down, and the crews that were halfway up the hill. So they say, fire a flare. So they fired a flare, and they spotted where they were. So the hill was pretty steep, and it had like trees on it. So Lassen flies up kind of to where the flare was. And of course, the hill's like this, and he's like this, and he's got the rotor blade. And so he's over them, and he's going to they're going to lower the lift and pull them up. So he start dropping the thing down. And the rotor blade was maybe 40 feet from the trees, 30 feet, because they could see. And so as they're putting the thing down, the flare goes out, and nobody else has a flare. So now it is pitch black. They can't see anything in front of them. So he starts trying to back away. When he does that, the rotor blade hits a tree. Okay, and now his plane goes kind of halfway out of control. He gets it back under control. It's vibrating. Knocked the door. One of the doors got knocked off and everything. So they back up, and they say, we can't do anything till we get more flares. And then they say, well, these guys need to get off this hill. So the co-pilot, and the guys have been saying, you got to come get us. You got to come get us. And so the co-pilot, Lieutenant J.G. Cook, he says, you're not going to get picked up till tomorrow unless you get off that hill and get down here in this paddy. So now the guys go, oh. So they start climbing down. The Rio had broken his leg. So one of the guys that got shot down had a broken leg. Unfortunately, it wasn't badly broken. So they start climbing down. And then some more aircraft show up. They drop a flare. So Lassen takes his helo, and he goes down to the paddy. He can't go into the paddy because it's wet. It's muck. So he hovers right above the paddy. The 2 pilots get down. About the time they're going to start running for the helo, the flare goes out again, and nobody else has a flare. And so now they have nothing. So he turns on the landing lights in the nose of this helicopter, big, bright, high candle power lights, to which the North Vietnamese now see everything, and they start pounding away at this helo. And the co-pilot tells these guys, run, run, run. So they come running across the paddy and all the muck. The guy with the broken leg got there first. So they get both of them in, and then away they go. So when they leave, they have very little fuel left. And so it's 20 miles out and about another 40 miles to the closest ship. So they go to the closest ship, which was not the one they took off from, and they land, and he had 5 minutes of fuel left when he landed. And so pretty amazing. So now they're all, they're in the destroyer, and they're, taking the guys down to sick bay, and the NFO that had the broken leg, they have him in a stretcher, and he says, I want to thank you guys, and Lieutenant Lassen doesn't even let him finish his things. He says, we've been out here for about 2 months, and we've been waiting for something like this to do. So he was awarded the Medal of Honor, and the rest of the crew got Navy crosses. So he won the Medal of Honor. It was, given to him by President Johnson. Stayed in the Navy and retired. When he retired, he'd been the commander of one of the helicopter training squadrons over at Whiting Field. So sadly, he died a year later of cancer, and this is pretty sad. So some of you guys, about 1/3 or more of you guys, are going to end up being rotary wing. When you get your wings, you're going to get your wings in the Clyde Lassen Auditorium over at Whiting Field, which is named after him, and there's a lot of stuff over there. So very, very historic. Very quiet guy, came from a small little town up north, and the least guy you would ever think that would hanging out like that. So JG, Lieutenant JG. Okay, so this is what I flew. So this is the Chance Bot A7 Corsair 2. So this is the highly modified Crusader made for attack use. So single engine, single pilot, big engine, TF41 turbofan engine, 15,000 pounds of thrust. This was the U.S. military state-of-the-art airplane when it came out back in the day, back in the mid-60s. So this was the first U.S. military airplane, and maybe the first military airplane in the world that had a HUD, head-up display. Very good HUD. Usually when you get the first of something, it's not very good, but this one was really good. It had computers were starting to come about, okay, at this point. So it had an inertial navigation system that was the best one in the world when it was designed specifically for this. It had a true digital computer bombing system. We had a real good air-to-ground radar in the nose, and had a Doppler system that could tell you the wind. So all these systems were all tied together. And in the days before smart bombs, which didn't come out till the late 80s, really, in great use, this was the plane of choice. If you had a pinpoint target and you needed a plane that could destroy the target in one pass and get out of there. And so that's what we did. And we did that, and we also, one of the main missions was what's called the basically it's anti-missile. You're trying to shoot down or take out ground targets, SAM site. And so you're basically dueling with the SAM site. And so we carried in those days, the Shrike missile, which would home in on the radar. So when you fired the missile, it would follow the radar beam right into that radar dish. And so that you would take the sight out. So it was kind of eerie because, they're trying to shoot at you or you're trying to shoot at them. Better missiles came out for that type of mission. The HARM missile, which was much, much better, because if the sight turned off their radar, the missile we carried, it didn't know where anything was anymore. The HARM, once it locked onto the sight, if they turned it off, it still knew where it was exact. So that became much better, especially in the first Gulf War. So this A7 right here led the very first strike of the very first Gulf War, the one where Saddam invaded Kuwait. And so it's a flight of 20 A7s, 2 in the morning, escorted by a squadron of FA-18 Tomcats, and there were 20 surface-to-air missile sites ringing Baghdad. And the 20 A7s showed up, and within 5 minutes, they'd taken out every site, all the site. So it was really, really good. They're very rugged, had a very lowest combat loss record in the Vietnam War, operated from 66 to 73. It's the longest range, single engine, U.S. carrier fighter that the Navy's ever had. You could fly across the Atlantic in this thing with 4 drop tanks. It was done twice. So at 3,500 miles, so great airplane. So one last aircraft here. So, in addition, mainly we've talked all about combat and all this sorts of stuff, but one of the things the U.S. military does better than any other country is what? Helping other countries when they have disasters or issues, right? I mean, who do they ask for? Us, okay? So one of the events I got to see that I was involved in, was the evacuation of Vietnam in late April of 1975. So my carrier, the Midway, we were involved in that. And so helicopter, with the first day, it was basically a 2-day affair. First day, U.S. military helicopters evacuated people out of Saigon. It was somewhat easy compared to like Afghanistan a couple of years ago, in that Saigon is about 30 miles from the ocean. So we got to the Midway, we were like 40 miles offshore. Afghanistan, they were 1,500 miles, 2,000 miles from anywhere. So it was a much harder event. So we were pulled in all the people from Saigon that the Navy was supposed to rescue. On the next day, we had many South Vietnamese fly their own helicopters and aircraft out to where the Navy ships were. And probably the most famous one of all these things involved this little Cessna Bird Dog, this plane hanging up here with the little yellow and black checkerboards. So that plane flew out on the second day with the South Vietnamese major flying it, South Vietnamese airplane. And he had his wife and 5 children in that airplane. There's only 2 seats. So when he got out to the Midway, he didn't have a radio. He dropped a note, said, "I've got my family with me." Skipper of the ship, Commander Larry Chambers, first wanted him, till he found that out, wanted him to ditch. These little Cessnas are hard to ditch because they've got little spindly landing gear, which tends to make them flip upside down. So Commander Chambers said, "We're going to take him aboard the ship." He'd never seen a carrier. This thing doesn't have a tail hook. So everybody's, oh. So in about 20 minutes, we had almost 60 South Vietnamese, mainly Hueys, UH-1s, all over the flight deck. We had to push them all out of the way off the angle, the runway. We did that in about 20 minutes. With about 1/3 of the crew up on the flight deck, including all the pilots that were not flying and everything. And so we cleared it off, and he came in and he landed successfully on the flight deck. We turned into the wind. We had a lot of wind down the angle, so this thing lands pretty slow, so he was able to stop. And so the doors opened, and out came him, his wife, and 5 kids. Okay, kids were all stuffed in the back of this airplane. There's nothing back there. So it was very stunning. That was pretty much the last event of the Vietnam War. After that, we took a couple more helos aboard, and we were the last carrier there. The rest of them started heading out. And so when we left, that was it. So that was pretty much the last event. They came back to the States, settled down north of Orlando, and he got a job with Disney World, and he worked for Disney World for 30 years. And when he retired, he was the assistant director of maintenance for the entire park. Okay, so there's a good example of some refugees that we hauled out of their country that came back and really made a success of themselves. So next, at 50th anniversary is in 2025. So everybody's still alive, including the skipper of the ship. So I imagine we're gonna have some big event here. Okay, so now we're gonna lead you guys over to where Mr. Goodspeed's gonna show you some artifacts.
With showing you some small artifacts and items from our collection the general public doesn't get a chance to see. There have been about 180,000 naval aviators designated over the years, which seems like a big number initially, but then if you think about how many millions of people lived in the United States since that time, 180,000 is really not a lot. So you're part of a very select group. These items here will represent some of those 180,000. You're welcome to come up and take pictures of them with your cell phones, but just please don't touch anything. But I'll quickly go through what they are, and then that'll be the capstone to your trip through naval aviation history and heritage today. We have a framed item here. They're wings of gold, and they're unique for a couple reasons. One is we take advantage routinely of naval aviators being so heavily involved in the astronaut program that we'll send stuff to them and they'll take it into space for us. So those wings of gold have circled the Earth many times on board a space shuttle. But what really makes them unique is in February of 1974, they were pinned on the chest of Lieutenant Junior Grade Barbara Allen, first female naval aviator. You'll see another set of wings. They are the oldest ones we have in the collection, or some of the oldest ones. Naval Aviator number 7, Godfrey de Chevalier, heck of a name. He was the first naval aviator to ever perform a carrier-arrested landing on USS Langley in October 1922. I heard Bob tell you about Commander Price, who spent those 11 days in a life raft. If you look on another box here, you'll see some rusted dog tags with a flare gun firing pin. Those are the dog tags he was wearing around his neck for the course of those 11 days. That's why they are rusted. You probably saw the B-25, the Doolittle Raider aircraft that we have here, which is a very notable mission in naval aviation. But just to give you the backdrop of it, as far as two of the key players, one obviously was Jimmy Doolittle. And for those of you who don't know much about Jimmy Doolittle, back in that era, he was probably one of the most acclaimed aviators in the world. Just look at his resume. He had a doctorate in aeronautics, I think, from MIT. He was a championship racing pilot. He was a a highly acclaimed test pilot. He did some of the early tests in blind flying or instrument flying, in addition to being a military pilot. So there were a few people who walked the face of the earth who were as good of an aviator as Jimmy Doolittle. But he did not know how to do one thing, which was to take off from an aircraft carrier in a bomb. So for that, he needed a naval aviator. So one day, there was a flight instructor around here, and back in 1942, there were hundreds of them around here. One of them just got picked and said, hey, you go down to Eglin Field, which is now Eglin Air Force Base. You'll find out what you're going to do when you get there. So Lieutenant Henry Miller shows up, and there he is face to face with Jimmy Doolittle. Think about their connection between those two individuals. If they didn't have certain characteristics, the whole operation may not have worked. Think about Jimmy Doolittle. What did he have to have? He had to have humility. He had to know that this person opposite him had not nearly the experience he did. But he had to be humble enough to know that he was deficient in something and to learn from this lieutenant. Lieutenant had to have a tremendous self-confidence in looking at Jimmy Doolittle and knowing that I have to tell this guy who has much more experience than me that he's not doing something right. And so because they had that understanding innately or consciously or subconsciously, that helped to do little raid work. So Rear Admiral Henry Miller retired before he passed away. He donated some items to us. So one of these is you'll see up here are his handwritten notes. It's a page from his notebook talking about how the Doolittle Raiders were doing. One is a letter from Jimmy Doolittle to him, thanking him for what he did and highlighting what happened on the mission. And then one is Lieutenant Henry Miller's orders to Eglin. He got $6 per diem back then, so we'd come a long way. You may have heard that George H.W. Bush, either on the tour or just through your own knowledge, was a naval aviator shot down off Chichijima in 1944. We have a unique artifact related to the future president, or former president. When he was shot down, it was a busy day for the submarine that was rescuing him. A lot of aircrew and aviators were shot down that day, and the submarine officer on board the submarine came up with the idea that he wanted to keep a souvenir. So he took a life raft, cut it into a square piece, and gave it to everybody that they rescued that day and said, put your thumbprint on it. So you'll see that. That's President Bush's signature, probably the day he was shot down or the day after as a young lieutenant junior grade. There's also a typewritten summary of a aviator who was shot down during the Battle of Midway. And as you prepare to get to water survival at some point, it's his recollections of what it was like floating around in a life raft for 5 days. Now, this individual was a young ensign. His name was John Magda. He went on to become a fighter ace with 5 kills in World War II, the 3rd commanding officer of the Blue Angels, and also tragically was killed in action in Korea in 1951. For the Marines in the room, there's a logbook over here. It belongs to the first fighter ace in Marine Corps history. His name was Marion Carl, and it's 1 month of his combat at Guadalcanal. And you'll notice he has kills there, which he says shot down 1 VB, which is a bomber, 1 VT, which is a torpedo plane. And the initials underneath each one of those tallies says JTS. And JTS is John Smith, who was his commanding officer and also a Medal of Honor recipient. So that's a pretty historic logbook. Over at this table, did you hear the story about Clyde Lassen, the helicopter pilot, received the Medal of Honor? We don't get a chance to see these very often. That is his actual Medal of Honor. He received it from President Lyndon Johnson in the White House. And I was here actually when he gave it to us. It was in 1993, which shows you how old I am. We had a reunion, the 4 guys on the helicopter and the 2 individuals they rescued. And they had not seen each other collectively since the night of the rescue, and it was 25 years to the day after the rescue. So it was a pretty cool event to hear them recount what went on that night. Lassen was very humble, as all Medal of Honor recipients I've ever met are. And he stood up at the end of the night. He had this medal around his neck, and we didn't know it, but he was dying of cancer. He had 10 months to live. And he said, he told the crowd that when they told him that you were going to receive the Medal of Honor, Lieutenant, his response or his first thought was, I didn't even know what that was. And then he said, honestly, since I've received it, it's spent most of its time in a box in my closet. So then he gave it to the museum. He wanted to be buried in Branca's Cemetery down the road, not in any dress uniform, but in the flannel shirt and overalls he used to go fishing. So that's the humility of the humble hero that he was. Who's heard of the Forstall Fire? Heard of the Forstall Fire? U.S. aircraft carrier off of North Vietnam, flight deck mishap, ends up having 134 sailors killed during the fire. But there was an individual named Ron Sladaber who was on board the carrier that day. He was a young lieutenant, later went on to become SecPac Fleet, and he was assigned the SDO duty. Everybody know what SDO is? It's a squadron duty officer, which generally is a very boring mission, and you'll all do it at some point. And you have a little logbook, not much different than what you'll see here, where you just essentially keep track of the comings and goings in the squadron, what's going on. It's generally really boring. So this is his blow-by-blow account of what happened during the Forstall Fire. So you'll read in there that smoke's coming into the ready room. They're wondering where Seaman so-and-so is, Airman so-and-so is, Lieutenant so-and-so is missing. But what you want you to notice in it is that his handwriting is impeccably neat. There's very few cross-outs, which shows he really was able to compartmentalize and focus on what his task at hand was. And I've never flown anything other than Delta and a COD a couple times, but most of the aviators I've talked to from one all the way to the present have told me one of the great skills you can have in naval aviation is the ability to compartmentalize. Because in a cockpit's emergency situation or anything going on in the cockpit or around you, you're gonna have all sorts of competing things coming at you, but if you compartmentalize, focus on the procedures and the task at hand, it's a very valuable skill to have. And that's what Lieutenant Sladaber showed. All of you will eventually get something called an aviation training jacket, an ATJ, which documents your flight training. The Navy saves these things for 50 years before they're destroyed. And we at the museum get a chance to pull historic. So that's Neil Armstrong's, right here, his aviation training jacket. There are 3 or 4, I can never remember, pink sheets in there, which is what you want to avoid getting. It's not a path to the moon, but he did have some deficiencies. And I pulled out a page here, which sort of reflects most every page in that flight record. And that is, there's not one flight that Neil Armstrong made the instructor didn't say that he needed to get better at something. And there are routinely times when the box below average is checked, which means one of the most acclaimed aviators to ever live routinely had to get better at something every single. And that's really from, again, the naval aviators I've talked to over the years, that is what you have to do. That's your commitment. Better every day, every flight better than the one before. This is a drinking cup from the Vietnam War, the Hanoi Hilton. For everybody know what the Hanoi Hilton was, it was a prisoner of war camp in North Vietnam. This belonged to a naval flight officer. He was in an F-4 Phantom, and he literally lived the highs and the lows of the Vietnam War. The high was in May of 1972. He and his pilot shot down 2 MiGs in one flight, which is very, very rare. So he received the Navy Cross for that mission. And then he got a new pilot. His first pilot went back to the United States to take charge of a little school called Top Gun. And Jack Etch, who this cup belonged to, was on another combat mission in August of 1972. They did the shoot down in May and August of 72. And he was in the back seat, new pilot. His hand is on a left hand hold up here. They're under enemy fire. He's playing around with some instruments over here that releases chaff from the F-4. And the next thing he knows, boom, mammoth explosion. He is knocked out of his senses for a brief time. He comes to, and his left hand is in his lap. There's blood all over his chest, and there's a combination of shrapnel and plexiglass from the canopy embedded in his chest. He leans up and see around the back seat into the front seat, and he yells at his pilot, "Can you get over the water?" The pilot is slumped down, mortally wounded, so Jack has to get out of the aircraft by himself with one hand. So I'm not sure if it was down this way or this way, but anyway, he yanks the ejection handle. He goes out. The airspeed of the airplane was approximately 500 knots when he punched out. It dislocated both of his elbows, which means packed up, and his hands are essentially like this. And down he goes. His ejection system works as advertised. He hits the ground, and there is pretty much poor treatment, horrific treatment from there on out for the next few days, except for one period of time when somebody shows him mercy. And it was a young Vietnamese girl came with a piece of gauze and wrapped his hand. And other than that, he was beaten up, taken in by truck to the Hanoi Hilton, and then he went to interrogation. The interrogation in the Hanoi Hilton was a stool and a table in a really Spartan room. Table had generally a piece of paper and a pen on it. And they would, the interrogator would come in and try to get the down pilot or aviator to talk to give information. And Jack kept giving them false information, try to get them to sign something that say they'd bombed civilian targets on purpose or something like that. And when he wouldn't do it, they would knock him off the stool. He'd lie there on the ground. Again, his elbows were like this. He really can't do much. And come back in, put him on the stool. They repeated that process over and over for 3 days. And his arms were starting to get black and blue for lack of blood circulation, and finally pleaded with them to give him medical attention, which they ultimately did. They took him to a hospital. No painkillers, no anesthetic, no nothing. They told him that you've inflicted pain on the Vietnamese people, and now you're going to feel pain on you. And so they amputated his left thumb without the benefit of anesthetic. They put him on the floor, so the doctor put a foot in his chest, and they yanked on his elbows. It popped him back in place. And then he stayed in captivity till March of '73. But the way the Vietnam POWs survived in captivity, they didn't survive as individuals. They maintained their chain of command. They maintained communication, and that enabled them to keep each other's spirits up, to resist, to have a code of conduct relayed back and forth that adjusted to the situation they were in. And they viewed themselves as still fighting. And Jack Inch's drinking cup, when you lean down, you'll see on the flat side of it, he is at 2 MiG-17s in flames. And so every time he drank or ate, he'd put that on the outside so his captors would see, yeah, I got the better of you when I was alive. And so that's what he brought back. He's still alive, saw him a few months ago. To show you Naval Aviation has a sense of humor, when he got back, he got a new call sign for the rest of his career, and to this day, fingers, because he only has 9. And so that's pretty cool. Final thing is a helmet bag. You saw the F-18 Hornet out there that was shot down a MiG-21 during Operation Iraqi Freedom, flown by Mark Fox. That is the helmet bag he carried on board the USS Saratoga. It still has his ensign's name tag on it, so it's likely what he carried in flight school, and he was a lieutenant commander and still carrying it. On that day, he shot down the MiG-21, and there's the flight schedule for that first day of Operation Desert Storm. And I'll conclude with this. Admiral Mark Fox. He went on to become a vice admiral, retired as deputy CENTCOM. A really incredible gentleman, nice guy. Got to know him over the years and talked to him about training, combat, and what it was like to fly in combat. And he made a statement that I relay to every class. And he said that, when you go into a combat situation, stressful situation, it's not like you become better because you're in that situation. You will perform quite simply to the level to which you have trained, period. Because all the adrenaline that's coming at you, all the uncertainty, you go back to that bedrock of training. So starting at night, then to primary, then to advance, FRS, fleet squadron, train like the next day is going to be the day that something really impactful happens to you. Just like all the stories you've heard today, those individuals got in the cockpit that morning and they had no idea what was going to happen that day. But when it did, they had to rely on that foundation of training, and that starts for you now. So that's all I have to say before I turn it over to Captain Moscow, but I will say this, and I work at a museum where we look at the past all the time, but it's a great honor to spend time with the future of naval aviation, which is you. So thank you for your attention today. Thanks for coming to the museum. It's your museum. It's the Museum of Naval Aviation. As long as you're in naval aviation and for the rest of your life as part of naval aviation, this is your museum. So come visit us often, and thank you for your attention today, and best of luck in flight school.